Okay, another fairly quick chapter going through another group of plants. These are the gymnosperms. Gym meaning naked. Gymnasiums is where people used to go to exercise naked. That's where the word connects. And sperm again meaning seed, as opposed to the angiosperms where the seed has something around it. Gymnosperms, they don't. Big developments in the plant world is the development of pollen. Pollen, generated in pines and an awful lot of gymnosperms in cones. They don't all have cones, but a lot of them have cones. And pollen is sperm in a casing that can go, without having to swim through the water, can go through the air, land near where the female egg cells are down inside the other plant, and generate a tube down to where the egg cells are, a pollen tube, sometimes called the sperm tube. So where did pollen come from? Well, the tracheophytes already had spores. Spores are in casings to make them resistant to drying. They can fly through the air without drying out in the meantime. And they make tubes, right? They have xylem and phloem. And if I had to guess, I would assume the pollen took those two abilities and kind of combined them to give the sperm a way to get where the egg cells are. But basically what you've got is a very important development. Another thing that develops that you see in the gymnosperms is what's called a woody stem, a brown casing, bark, that surrounds a core. Now the core is full of xylem. Xylem is what makes the tree rings. We'll talk about tree rings when we get back to that in angiosperms. And on the underside of the bark is the phloem. So the outer layers of xylem, the whole tree trunk isn't full of working xylem. The outer layers are new and they're moving water and minerals up to the leaves, which are very often needle-like in these guys. And then the bark is conducting food down to the roots. And these guys do have they've got roots with tubes in them. So we've got the trifecta here. We've got true leaves, true stems, and true roots. This is also why if something happens that peels the bark off of a tree all the way around, it will eventually die because the roots are not getting fuel anymore. And that will eventually kill the tree. It takes a while, but. So, in a lot of conifers, the cones they look different, and they're different places. The male cones, since they're generating these little bitty pollen out into the air where they're going to have to carry through the air to places, they tend to be produced much higher up on the trees. And the cones that make them are fairly small. The female cones are going to eventually generate seeds that are going to be released. They have little wings on them too. They can travel a ways in the air. But it's more room needed for that kind of production. So those seeds, or those cones, tend to be bigger. And since part of their job is to catch the pollen, they tend to be lower on the tree. You know, the pollen doesn't actively fly, it floats through the air, so it's going to settle. And so you want your female cones to be lower. The pollen lands on the female cones and then works its way down to where the egg cells are. It is not unusual for that to take more than a year. They're not building these tubes really, really quickly, but they're trees. They got lots of time. And then you get fertilization. There's the tube, and there's the seeds with little wings on it. The seeds kind of sort of look like maple seeds. you know, similar sort of, they don't have the two wings on them, but they have a similar sort of flat surface that helps them flutter through the air. You writing this stuff down? I hope so. So these are the gymnosperms. And down here is where you write about the pollen and the cones and all the other stuff. This includes the conifers, the ginkgos, GINKG. Remember I said that there were trees near where I went to school that were, there were male trees and female trees separately. Those are ginkgo trees. They don't produce cones, but they're in the gymnosperm group. And then there's kind of a weird group that I have no idea what they look like. You can look it up, I suppose. The needlies. Let's see, can you actually see that? No, you can't quite see that. There we go. So these have true stems. There are variants, the ginkgos, for instance, that have flat leaves, but it's very, very common in the gymnosperms. We talked about the conifers are a huge part of this, to have long, thin leaves that have a fairly decent waterproofing coating on them. That's the cuticle. So they don't lose water all that effectively. They do have pores that open and close, unlike the tracheophytes where the pores are kind of locked open all the time. So gymnosperms have done a pretty good job of spreading into areas that are fairly dry. And in fact, in many places in the world, they've been outcompeted by the last group we're going to look at, the more modern angiosperms. But when you get into areas that are colder, areas that are not as hospitable soil-wise, then you're going to find a switch over from angiosperms being the major trees in forests to gymnosperms. If you go farther north, the angiosperm, the flat-leaf trees will give way to the gymnosperms as you go north. It would be true for south, but there's not a lot of tundra on the south end of the planet. You go up mountains. You can see this to some extent in the Adirondacks. Mountains are not really tall enough for you to see it really clearly, but you will see a suggestion of a transition from angiosperm trees at the lower altitudes to gymnosperms to eventually there not being any trees at all. Same thing true going north. Eventually the conditions just don't support trees at all. That's why there's a tree line on really tall mountains. And there's a tree line going north. There's still plants growing beyond that. Not so much on the mountains, but not, big gymnosperms. In theory, there's still sporophytes and gametophytes. The trees are considered to be the sporophytes. The cones are considered to be the gametophytes. I can't tell you why. The trees don't do asexual reproduction typically. So why they hold on to those terms for the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, although some of the angiosperms can do asexual reproduction, but it's not typical. But those are still applied here. I can't really tell you why. Okay. I could probably squeeze the angiosperms into this video as well, but I'm going to stop it here so we'll have a dedicated gymnosperm video.